Hello, this is Claire Levy. Coming up in this edition of the DRWF podcast, Living with Diabetes, we have the latest instalment of our special series of programmes looking specifically at women's health. In this episode, I've been talking to Dawn Adams, who is living with type 1 and experienced issues of early symptoms of menopause.
I knew virtually nothing about diabetes. My weight had gone from 8 stone to 5 stone 9 in the space of about 3 months. And I was so tired. I just could not shake off the fatigue. And she said, "I have an ambulance in standby waiting to collect you. We thought you were dead." So that was my introduction to what diabetes actually meant and what it was actually all about at its very worst. I then started to have hot flushes, which I know we think of as a very traditional symptom. That came for me about the age of 45. There's very little information about type 1 diabetes and menopause. But I'd reached a point where even socialising, talking to people, going into the workplace to do my job was becoming a massive challenge. I had lost all self-belief, self-confidence, and any sense of being able to function.
Hear the full interview coming up next.
Views, information or opinions contained in podcasts do not necessarily represent the opinions, standards or policies of DRWF. The inclusion of details about products or services does not indicate DRWF endorsement of them. The aim of podcasts is to educate and inform, and we endeavour to ensure that the information provided in them is accurate. It's not a substitute for medical or health advice from a healthcare professional who's aware of the facts and circumstances of your individual situation. We always recommend that advice be sought from your GP or diabetes nurse before making any changes to medication or before using any products or services referenced by DRWF. Neither DRWF nor any of its employees or owners shall be held liable or responsible for the accuracy or completeness, for any errors or omissions in podcasts, or for any damage you may suffer as a result of failing to seek competent medical or health advice from a professional who is familiar with your situation.
Dawn Adams is a midwife. You're married with 4 grown-up boys. That must be interesting. And you were diagnosed with type 1 at the age of 22, I believe. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
And started having some menopause symptoms in your early 40s?
Probably late 30s, really starting to come into play at that time, but it wasn't until I was in my 40s that I went, I'm just having too many weird things going on here. I wonder, is this possibly the menopause thing starting? Yeah.
So Dawn, could you just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, I work as a midwife. So I actually I started training as a primary school teacher. So I was diagnosed in my last term as a primary school teacher training in Belfast. I taught for 13 years, and in that time I'd had my 4 sons. And a year after my 4th son was born, my husband had actually said that a colleague of his had gone into direct entry midwifery, which had just started at Queen's University in Belfast. And I'd been really interested in how the hospital looked after people with type 1 diabetes, which was the only type of diabetes I was really aware of at that stage. And the interaction of the neonatal nurses, because 3 of the boys spent time in the unit with me whenever I was going in and out. And I thought, this is a really worthwhile job. So in 2006, I went back and I retrained as a midwife. And I've been doing that now, qualified in 2009. And around 2019, I took a career break to go to Ulster University. Obviously, going to 2 different universities in the country wasn't enough, so yeah, I added Ulster to that. And I went back to do a PhD in type 1 diabetes, pregnancy and wearable technology. Unfortunately, I didn't complete the PhD due to health reasons, but that was what has kind of led me into a lot of the advocacy work that I do now. It's given me the courage to do a lot of the advocacy work that I do now.
So you were diagnosed when you were 22. Can you just talk about what that diagnosis was like? What happened to you? Did you know anything about diabetes?
I knew virtually nothing about diabetes. My mum's aunt had type 2 diabetes, it turns out. And she died whenever I was about 5 or 6 years of age. So I don't really remember her, apart from mum buying her special jam at Christmas time, which is obviously not a very appropriate thing to get anybody. But as I discovered in the hospital 16, 17 years later, I had very classical symptoms. I was losing weight. I was so thirsty. I could not quench my thirst. I think I was drinking about 8 to 10 litres of water per day prior to being admitted to the hospital. I was constantly running to the loo, and I had people saying, if you didn't drink so much water, you wouldn't need to run to the loo. But I was like, I have to drink. I am so thirsty. My weight had gone from 8 stone to 5 stone 9 in the space of about 3 months. And I was so tired. I just could not shake off the fatigue. So I was very involved in Guide Association, and I'd come across to Sheffield for a BYC weekend, British Youth Council, and my then boyfriend, now husband, picked me up from the airport, and he'd said, have you been drinking whiskey on the plane? I said, no, I haven't been. He said, what do you weigh? And he said, I think you might have type 1 diabetes, because his friend was diagnosed in their first year at high school, and he had recognised the smell of ketones from my breath, and immediately that just triggered memories of his friend being diagnosed with type 1. So I contacted the GP the next morning at 8:30. They had me in the surgery at 9:15, and by lunchtime I was in hospital with a full-on diagnosis of type 1 diabetes.
So what do you think might have happened if he hadn't had that knowledge?
Well, the GP had phoned the surgery at about 9:30, 9:45 to say that I was coming in. And because I was a student, I didn't really have anything much in the way of decent pyjamas for going into hospital. So I got my mum to take me to Marks and Spencer's to buy new pyjamas. So tragic. And I said, I can't go into hospital. I can't go in my student drama t-shirt. So went and got the pyjamas and packed a bag, got nice toiletries because I had no idea what being in hospital was like or how long I was going to be there. And packed up some of my stuff from university because I was trying to write 2 dissertations at the time as well and prepare for finals, which were meant to be 4 weeks later. So when we arrived at the front of the hospital, the actual hospital that I was admitted to used to be a Victorian workhouse. So I was in one of the bits where children had been kept, lived, grew up in the workhouse days, and the sister of the ward was standing at the front door with sweat on her brow, and she looked at me and said, "Are you done?" I went, yes. And she said, "I have an ambulance in standby waiting to collect you. We thought you were dead." So that was not quite the welcome that I was expecting. And she then brought me in and said, "No, we have been genuinely worried. We know that you're really very ill, and if you had waited any longer, you wouldn't have been coming in to us. You would have been going to one of the local mortuaries." So that was my introduction to what diabetes actually meant and what it was actually all about at its very worst.
But you did walk in?
I did, yeah. She couldn't quite believe with the glucose levels that I had that I was doing that. But yeah, I think it was more the determination in me.
I would imagine so. So you've had your midwifery training.
Yeah.
Do you think that helps with your own self-management?
Not really. There isn't a huge amount of time spent in any education courses around diabetes itself. The thing which really rang out over those 3 years of training, one of my lecturers was a diabetes specialist midwife in one of the other teaching hospitals in the country. And she had said that the placenta was an organ of insulin resistance. And I still use those words that she used whenever women are diagnosed with GDM, her coming through our hospital as well. And for me, that suddenly made everything that I'd experienced in my 4 pregnancies make sense, because I thought that it was something I personally was doing or not doing that caused my insulin requirements pre-pregnancy to go from 4 units, 4 units, 4 units, and 12 units up to, I think by my first pregnancy, the insulins that I was on, I was over 60 units of insulin every night. And I couldn't understand why this was happening. I thought it was me. And whenever she said the placenta is an organ of insulin resistance, the hormones that it produces are what make you very insulin resistant, it was almost as if somebody had suddenly given me a reason that wasn't me focused, that was something within me focused, but not something that I actually had any level of control over or any ability to manipulate or change apart from taking the additional insulin. So it was actually very validating to think this wasn't me, this was my body, this was another organ within my body requiring this additional insulin.
Can you tell us a little bit about what then happened when you reached late 30s, early 40s with your diabetes and how that affected you?
So after my 4th son was born, I had gone from having 1 period every 28 days. I was having a period every 14 days. So 2 periods a month with 4 children under the age of 7 was quite challenging, and having bleeding 4, 5, 6 days each time, it just seemed like I was on a constant cycle of buying sanitary pads, buying tampons, buying moon cups, whatever I could get just to try and stem the flow. So I had contacted my GP to see, was there something that was going on? Because I'd had 3 caesarean sections. Was it something to do with caesarean sections? Was it something to do with having had 4 children, so very close together? And they actually referred me down to Belfast, where I had an endometrial ablation. So the lining of the womb was burnt away, and that stopped the periods, which was phenomenal. Yeah, that was great, because I basically didn't have any periods then until around 2019, 2020. But other symptoms then had started to come into play. I noticed that my insulin requirements were changing. And I was thinking that was maybe to do simply with becoming older. But I found that my mood was not as good as it had been previously. And I think it was whenever I then started to have hot flushes, which I know we think of as a very traditional symptom. That came for me about the age of 45, 46, so I was already post-ablation. But that was the point where I started thinking, is this a hypo? And I was convinced that it was a hypo because the sweat was lashing off me, and I would have been quite prone to nighttime hypos anyway. But I was waking up and my pyjamas were soaking most nights, and I was having to get up, shower, change bed linen, change pyjamas. And I thought, there's something else going on here. This is not just hypos. And when I was checking blood glucose levels, I was like, no, what is happening? Fatigue was a major issue as well. And skin suddenly became very easily irritated. I've always had quite dry skin. Even before diagnosis with diabetes, I always would have had very dry skin as a child. But I suddenly found I was taking a reaction to glucose sensor adhesives. I was taking a reaction to insulin pump cannula adhesives. And I thought I was developing additional allergies, or that this was something else, another autoimmune condition. So I tried to read into it, but there's very little information about type 1 diabetes and menopause. And I couldn't find anything that was specific to type 1. There was more about type 2 potentially being caused by menopause. There was more information for women who had type 2 who were going through menopause, but nothing for type 1, apart from a trend diabetes leaflet, which basically said check your blood glucose levels more regularly. which I couldn't really do because I was already wearing a glucose sensor and I was scanning that. I had managed to get it to Bluetooth to my phone using alternative devices. And I thought, what else can I do? So I tentatively contacted my GP, expecting to be told, no, you're not going to get any treatment for this at all. Wise up, sort yourself out. This is a normal process. But I'd reached a point where even socialising, talking to people, going into the workplace to do my job was becoming a massive challenge. I had lost all self-belief, self-confidence, and any sense of being able to function in a worthwhile way. So whenever I phoned her, I went over different symptoms and I said, is there any possibility you could let me try some hormone therapy, please? If it doesn't work, I will stop it, because I'm not averse to not having something, but I think I need something at this point in time. I was very fortunate. A lot of my peers have had GPs saying to them, I just think you're depressed. Here are some antidepressants. And that hasn't fixed their mood. That hasn't fixed the skin irritation. It hasn't fixed the ringing in the ears, and it certainly hasn't fixed the night sweats or the hot flushes. So I tried she gave me patches and she gave me progesterone. And within the matter of a week to 10 days, I suddenly felt like I had felt in the early 2000s. I was thinking, I'm back. Hello, I'm back again. This is me. And it actually felt like such a relief to know that while this maybe wasn't a route that I wanted to go down, just like taking insulin wasn't a route that I had really wanted to go down. Having type 1 in the background with that stage actually made the hormone replacement therapy side of it easier, because I knew I'd been taking insulin, which is a hormone, at that point for almost 30 years. And I was now replacing other hormones that my body was no longer producing in the quantities I needed for me to function normally. And I know there are people who go through menopause and don't require any additional therapies. But for me, I was really struggling just to be me at all and to do the things that I was used to do. And I've always lived a very full, very active life. It's always been very busy. It's always been an ability to say no to anything because it's always too interesting. And I was suddenly able to go back into that. I was back in my stride. And for me, that was a big thing in itself. And the fact that the hot flushes had stopped was tremendous. The fact that I could actually hold a thought in my head for longer than 3 seconds was wonderful.
You said there wasn't much out there at the time. Is there more information now? Do you think type 1 and menopause, you were saying about, you've been taking insulin for 30 odd years, which is a hormone. Do you think there is that link between symptoms, maybe more aggressive symptoms, and having type 1?
I think it's the confusion of symptoms between what's a hypo or what's hyper, because when you're hypo, you do sweat, you do become very teary, very emotional, emotions are very heightened, the fatigue after hypo. And those are things which seem to sit very much in that menopause. Whenever you look at Green's climacteric scale, or whenever you look at the balance symptoms of menopause, and you're thinking, an awful lot of this is stuff that I experience anyway with type 1. Again, whenever your blood glucose levels go above 12 for any length of time, there's that feeling of heaviness. There's that feeling that you've really let everybody around you down because you haven't managed to keep your glucose levels within that ideal, optimal target range. And the fatigue that goes with that as well, and the brain fog that quite often sits in the type 1 space as a result of roller coaster glucose levels. So many of the symptoms completely overlap, and loss of libido would be another thing, which again, we know that happens with women with type 1 diabetes. It's not particularly well researched, but there's a couple of very good PhD papers which have come out in the last 2 years, which have shown that decline in libido in women with type 1 over a period of time. It just made so much more sense that it wasn't simply the diabetes that was the cause of it, and the fact that it was a lot of those symptoms were suddenly fixed with additional hormones suddenly made sense. And again, I'm very conscious of the fact that I've been very fortunate that I've had a GP who was willing to listen, who was willing to go along with my random requests. But for me, that worked. And it's not something that I would say that everybody should try that route. But I've also had a massive peer support group around me over that period of time. We've kind of, from occasional givens out on Twitter about why is there not more information about this? Why can I not find anything about this? And a community of us have grown from that into an international peer support group. And everybody shares different things into it. So even making dietary changes. A friend with type 2 had said she had found it very helpful trying to have 20 different plants in her diet each day. So whenever I'd talk to her about it, I said, how do you fit in 20 different plants? How is that possible? I thought, I'm going to just be eating my way around all the supermarkets from here on in. But she was talking about the fact that tea and coffee are plants because they grow, which again, to me, this was, home economics suddenly, didn't ever cover this. And adding different herbs, different spices to foods. And she said, so if you've black pepper, that's one. If you've a cup of tea in the morning, that's two. If you throw in some marjoram, thyme, basil, oregano to something like a spaghetti bolognese or a lasagna, she said you've got your plants up to 6, plus your onions, plus your tomatoes. And I thought, right, okay, this is maybe a way to go with this as well. So I started to look at what I was including in my diet. So rather than cutting foods out, it was starting to add more things to it. And things like sage can help with hot flushes as well. So there's other alternative things out there. Friends from African nations were saying about adding papaya because that helps as well. Other friends were saying, they would include particular fruits, particular vegetables, and they'd find those to be helpful with different symptoms. So that, for me, was a big learning curve. But again, not a huge amount of information around type 1 and that. So quite often we're having to go back to what information is there and try to incorporate that into life with type 1 and thinking, well, is this going to be okay? Or is this going to have a contraindication with other medications that people might be taking? How is this going to impact overall health? But at the end of the day, it's like, well, we'll give this a try. If it works, this is great. If it doesn't work, we can stop that and try something else. So it's very much mix and match.
What sort of advice would you have for people who are at the early stages, and where would they go, do you think, to find out more information?
A number of the diabetes charities now have specific information pages. I was involved in helping to write ones with Diabetes UK and DRWF before they became Breakthrough Type 1 Diabetes, which I worked with a researcher from Ulster University, Vivian Coates, and we had started to put together things that might be useful, might be helpful. And I know that those pages have been updated as more conversations happen. And as there's an increase in interest, I think people like Davina McCall, while they may not have type 1 diabetes or any type of diabetes, have opened up the conversations. That has shifted a focus now into the type 1 space. And one of the things that we had all said within the group was we were involved in research projects in our pregnancies, which have helped to shape the way that type 1 pregnancies now go. And we said, well, now we're here and we're experiencing this life stage, which a number of us didn't think we would actually live long enough to experience. I know when I was diagnosed, I was told if I lived past my 40th birthday, we would have that conversation about menopause, because I did actually ask in the hospital, because my mum was menopausal at that point in time. And we've now said, okay, we're here, we're going through this. What can you do to support us? What do you want to know from us? And how can we help to build resources for those who are coming behind us? Because not everybody with type 1 is going to go through a pregnancy. But if you are spared and you do live long enough and you're supported by your healthcare team to get to this point in life, you're going to experience perimenopause, you're going to experience menopause. And there's probably more women with type 1 who will experience those conditions than will ever go through a pregnancy itself. So, yeah, that's been a challenge.
You talked briefly about the adhesive having a problem. So you are a tech wearer.
Yes, I am.
Has that made a difference to your diabetes care?
It has been a massive benefit in terms of it kept me between the hedges. It's helped me to keep my glucose levels much more within the range that clinicians would like us to be within. As you might have gathered, I generally give things a wee go and see if it works. And before hybrid closed loops became a standard thing within the diabetes world, I had excellent support from local friends and friends here in GB to build a do-it-yourself hybrid closed loop system. And for me, that has been a massive help. And now I'm saying, well, if this is helping me, the commercial hybrid closed loop systems, while they're being very much focused on children, particularly those now going through puberty, and women who are experiencing pregnancy and going out the other side into breastfeeding, there's definitely a role for hybrid closed loop therapies within any phase in life where your body is going through a landmark change at all. So I think it would be amazing to see that being made more available for women who are perimenopausal, who are struggling to get glucose levels to come back into the ranges they would like them to be, who'd like to see an improvement in time and range. Because we know that normalising your blood glucose levels as much as possible helps to reduce the potential harms of long-term consequences of living with diabetes. And we're all very familiar with those. We've seen the adverts. We know people who've had very sad, very tragic outcomes as a result of living with type 1. And we all want to live as well as we possibly can, for as long as we possibly can, in as healthy a body as we possibly can. So it would be amazing to see a greater uptake and a greater accessibility and availability of the technology. Even connected pens, I think those often get overlooked in the midst of all the conversations around tech. Everybody thinks, oh, if it's not hybrid closed loop, it doesn't count. But I think even having the rollout right across the UK for glucose sensors has been a massive step in the right direction. Not everybody wants to have a device attached to them all the time, and insulin pumps are basically another appendage stuck to your body. But connected pens also have that potential when used with CGMs, that there's an interaction between the two devices.
I think you've probably touched on this, but do you think the menopause and that early stage, did it affect your career, and how has your career gone in more recent years?
It made me, I say, I kind of lost a lot of confidence. It made me very unwilling to even consider applying for any additional jobs within the workplace, or to speak up and advocate. One of the things midwives do is they're people's advocates. Somebody who's in labour, you're advocating for that person. And you're listening to them, you're passing that on to the rest of the team if there's something that they would like, or if there's something that's not quite right. And while I would have done that, I don't think I would have been just as confident about speaking up. And normally I'm not brilliant about speaking up for myself, whether that you believe that or not is another matter. But other people, I will quite happily fight other people's corners, regardless of what other opinions coming back are. But I actually found that very challenging to do. I found that if I had said, the lady I'm looking after has said this, could you please come and see? And I was told, oh, that's fine, she's normal and it's nothing to worry about. And I would have gone back, but I would have gone back a second time and said, look, I know you've said this is normal, but I'm not entirely convinced that it's. I would have been quite apologetic about doing advocacy work then. But I think having now reached a nice plateau where I feel more like myself, where I feel that I'm more able, more capable, and I don't think it's just an age thing, I don't think it's a duration of career, I will quite happily go and challenge and say, this is not right and I need you to come right now. And if you don't come right now, we'll have a wee chat about this later on.
And so in your own life, you've had 4 grown-up boys and a husband, so quite a lot of men in the household. How have they dealt with you, and have they been understanding of your type 1 diabetes and the menopause, or have they just kind of, left you to it?
The type 1 diabetes they have all grown up with, obviously, and have always been they've all been very good, every last one of them, about picking up on low blood glucose levels, high blood glucose levels, and as I said about different symptoms of menopause, echoing hypos and hypers. And there would have been times they were saying, what are your blood glucose levels? Because my behaviour wasn't sitting with normal glucose range behaviour. I was like, well, it's 6.5. What's your problem? Just go, okay, so why are you behaving like this? So they were curious as to why I was acting out of character. But I've had a number of conversations now with them and said, listen, you're living in a house with somebody who's going through perimenopause, menopause. You need to know about this because you are going to encounter plenty more people like me out in the wild. They're not going to have type 1 diabetes, so you cannot blame erratic behaviour on high blood glucose levels or low blood glucose levels. You've got to understand that this is a normal process. You've got to understand that this is something which happens, and it's great that people live long enough for this to happen. And these are things that you can do to help support as well. So I've had a couple of interviews with some of the other diabetes charities, and I've been interviewed a couple of times for podcasts, and they've all gone back and listened to what I've said. So they love when they get a wee mention as well. They're like, oh, you mentioned us again. But they've also been very tuned in to what the symptoms have been like and what the impact has been like. And for them, I think it's one thing when you see it and you're living it as an observer, as someone who's not actually that person, but whenever they're hearing what it's been like for me, that for them has been a really valuable life lesson. And it's something that they will now come and talk about. And even my eldest son is 27, and he has said, my friend's mum seems to be going through that stage that you've gone through. Look, can I give her your number? Would you mind if I pass it on? Or have you anything that you can advise, recommend? And I think he and my second son have been recommending some of the podcasts to their friends to go and have a listen to try and get some perspective on it, because there's a lot of shame and a lot of stigma around diabetes. There's a lot of shame and a lot of stigma around menstruation, and the same very much for menopause. It's seen as a cheap joke. You know, if you lose your temper, it's time of the month, it's her stage of life, it's her diabetes, whatever. And while that might get a laugh on a stage with a very uneducated audience, it's not funny for people who are going through it at that point in time. Either the person who's actually experiencing it or the people who are sharing a house with that person. So for them, the education side of it has been really useful, and they've all come back and said, it's actually really good that you've shared this, because I've been able to pass this information on to someone else. Or they've said about their mum, their aunt, their employer has been like this, and the boys have been able to provide a bit of background knowledge and information. And I think the more educated people are, it's like everything in life, the more educated people are, the more understanding they have, and you start to break down that fear of talking about it, and it becomes more normalised, which is a good thing, I think.
So is there anything missing, do you think, in information that other charities, ourselves, could look at to help people learn a little bit more, understand a bit more?
I think it would be very helpful to have even a short education session for healthcare professionals. Because for me, the challenge was when I went to my diabetes consultant, and I love her, I adore her, she's so fabulous, and she's supported me so many times along my journey over the last 12 years. Whenever I went to her and I said about, I think I'm experiencing menopause, and she says, oh, I have a leaflet here, and she handed me that trend leaflet. And that didn't really fix what was going on with me. And she said, but you're a midwife, you know these things. And I said, no, I don't know about these things. I said, I know about the stuff that happens before you get to this stage. And I said, I just know that this is a change. It's like reverse puberty. And she said, oh, well, I don't know anything. There's no research out there. And I've never actually had any education on this. And I kind of thought as an endocrinologist, she would maybe have had more of an understanding, which is not a slight on her at all. But speaking to other healthcare professionals at different points over the last decade, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of education. There isn't much more information now available around type 1 and menopause. Equally, there's not a huge amount for women who have pre-existing type 2 diabetes before they hit this life stage to support them. So if there was something that could be produced, I say in the way of a short education module even, would be phenomenal. It's great that Trend have updated their menopause information that's now available. And it was so good to see Breakthrough put out their Growing Older with Diabetes document a few months ago. But not everybody has time to read that. And quite often healthcare professionals will be more actively engaged if they get CPD for doing something. And you don't get CPD for reading a document. You don't get CPD for flicking through a book. But if there was a way of actually being able to actively support and learn more, I think that would start to open up a dialogue that whenever I was menstruating regularly, every time I went into clinic, I was asked, was I considering a pregnancy? Was I thinking about maybe taking folic acid? Was I working towards having an improved HbA1c in advance of getting pregnant? But I think that's a conversation that should keep going, but taking out the pregnancy and asking, is there anything that you think might be impacting your glucose levels? You know, you're now this age. Do you think that you might be experiencing perimenopause? Are you showing any symptoms? Is there anything that you've noticed that's different? Because we feel that time in an appointment is very clinical, it's very numbers-based, it's very fact-based. It's your blood glucose, it's your lipid levels, it's your blood pressure, it's your eyes, it's your feet, but the whole person isn't in the room. It's only bits of you, and it's only the things that are very measurable in terms of actual numbers there on the table or on the devices in front of you. But maybe doing a wee bit more of a conversation opener would be a really useful thing, a really helpful thing, because not everybody would be as open as I am, and not everybody would be as quick to challenge as I would be.
DRWF, staying well until a cure is found.
You're listening to Living with Diabetes, the DRWF podcast, and our special series looking at some of the challenges facing women living with diabetes. You can find helpful guidance on all aspects of diabetes, together with details on how to support the charity, fundraising events, news and information on our website at drwf.org.uk. Thanks to all our guests who have helped us explore diabetes and women's health, and to you for joining us. Coming up next time...
They took a finger prick, and I don't remember the number, but it was somewhere way too high. And then I don't remember that much, but they basically said, we need to rush you to hospital, and you'll have to take injections for the rest of your life. I remember that sentence very clearly, and when you are 9 years old, it's absolutely terrifying. School was okay. I think I got like the odd comments from the boys, you know, giving me like weird like names. I was always like, I don't know if I get drunk, whether I'm still aware of the thing that I have to manage that could potentially be life-threatening.
So how quickly would you mention to somebody that you're living with type 1, and how quickly does that impact on, say, a sexual relationship?
Yeah. I'm very open. I've always been open with that. I mean, I have the devices on my arm, but for me, it's part of me. If somebody has a problem, then leave me alone, like date someone else. That's what I asked actually online. I was like, what do you guys do with your insulin pump when you have sex? It's a topic that's not really considered a lot when we talk about diabetes management, even though sex is such a key part of general well-being.
This podcast has been supported by Abbott. Living with Diabetes is a Blue Aurora media production for DRWF. Copyright 2025. Diabetes Research and Wellness Foundation. All rights reserved.